Kentucky Senator Rand Paul says he's disappointed that the president has in some cases used the families of gun victims as props to push gun control. Senator Paul's comments came Wednesday during an interview with the Christian Science Monitor. This is about an hour.
So I'm going to call on you. I'm going to do a little intro, call on you for remarks for a couple of minutes, and then we'll do questions, and then we'll end promptly at 9:30. Okay, everybody, here we go. See what iron control I exercise. I'm Dave Cook from the Monitor. Thank you for coming. Our guest today is Senator Rand Paul. This is his first visit with the group. He was born in Texas, attended Baylor University before being admitted to Duke University, where he earned his medical degree, established his ophthalmology practice in Bowling Green, Kentucky, founded an anti-tax group called Kentucky Taxpayers United, and in 2009, in his first bid for elective office, our guest ran for the Senate seat vacated by retiring Senator Jim Bunning. He routed the Republican establishment's candidate in the primary and won decisively in the general. When he got to the Senate, he quickly founded the Tea Party caucus. Finally, for you breakfast Tea Party buffs, a group of which I may be the only member, of our nearly 3,800 breakfasts, only 2 times have we had both a father and a son as guests. We hosted our guest dad, former Representative Ron Paul, in September 2011. The only other father-son team was Mitt Romney and his dad, Michigan Governor George Romney. So much for biography and breakfast trivia. Now on to mundane mechanical matters. As always, we're on the record. Please, no live blogging or tweeting. In short, no filing of any kind while the breakfast is underway. There's no embargo when the breakfast is over, except that C-SPAN has agreed not to use video of the session for at least an hour after the breakfast ends to give those of us in the room a chance to file. If you'd like to ask a question, please do the traditional thing and send me a subtle, non-threatening signal, and I'll happily call on one and all. We'll start off, now that he's had 2 bites, we'll start off by offering our guests the opportunity to make some opening comments, then we'll move to questions from around the table. And with that, Senator, thanks again for doing this. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. It sounds like with all those rules that we're going to really create some news this morning. I don't know about that, but as I was shaking everybody's hand,
We live in hope, Senator. Yeah. We live in hope.
As I was going around the room and shaking everybody's hand, I was thinking, I was sort of in a wedding receiving line. So if anybody feels compelled to send me a wedding gift, I can get you an address. I think it has to be under $14, though, to meet the Senate gift limits. But no, I'm glad to be here this morning. And I was told anything short of 13 hours of speaking would be fine. And so I'll try to keep my remarks concise. In fact, I think question and answer will probably do us and serve us better. But I'm glad to be here. I came to Washington because I want to make a difference. I think that our nation faces significant problems, and I think if we don't address the deficit, if we don't address it, I've become more and more convinced that we don't necessarily go gradually into problems, that we could go precipitously into a problem. And I say that with reference to 2008 and to the crisis, that I think there is, even when things seem to be going pretty well, there is and are some lurking dangers within our economy. One would be interest rates rising, and I ask this question all the time to people I consider to be smart, big bankers, people, in the major capital centers of the world. Can we control interest rates and keep interest rates low? Is there a breaking point at which the central bank cannot keep interest rates at this point? Because interest rates of 5%, interest rates of 7%, or when I was a kid, interest rates of 19% or 21%, I think would be catastrophic with this burden of debt. Seems to work right now, but I also think that there's a certain illusion, both of wealth in the stock market and an illusion of the ease at which we can manage our debt. And so those are my concerns, and I think because of that we have to do some long-range things. I've proposed several things since I've come. I've proposed fixing the Social Security problem. We're $6.5 trillion short. To me, it's an actuarial problem. You simply raise the age gradually, a couple of months a year, raise it to 70, and you fix 2/3 of the Social Security deficit. You can fix the remaining third by means testing the benefits. I thought that there'd be bipartisan support for that because the President has occasionally said he was for entitlement reform, but he, I think, has not shown much leadership on this. Seems to be inching more towards it, but I had a meeting with him, and back when we used to have 47 Republican senators, we sat down around a table like this with he and the Vice President. So this is probably a year and a half ago, and I told him precisely that I think we should be able to get people on both sides of the equation just essentially fix Social Security. Medicare is a more difficult problem. It's $35 to $40 trillion short. And these are the problems that drive our deficit. 2/3 of your budget is, and everybody here knows this, 2/3 of the budget is entitlements. So we have another bill that fixes Medicare. It's more difficult, though. It's $35 to $40 trillion in the whole. We do the same thing to Medicare. We raise the age gradually over about 20 years, similar to what they did in 1983. We means test the benefits, means test the premiums, means test everything. And unfortunately, that doesn't fix the problem. So even with raising the age and means testing, you don't fix the problem in Medicare. You do have to have some market forces. So I thought, well, it was John Kerry's idea in his presidential election to put everybody in the whole country into the federal employee benefits plan, the federal health insurance plan. So I said, this was a Democrat idea. This will be easy. I'll just go to John Kerry and say, let's use your idea, not for the whole country, but let's use it for senior citizens. Let everybody have the federal employee health plan. I think the public would like it if they were told they're getting the same health plan that their congressman gets. I think it should be eminently sellable. And it's similar to what Paul Ryan talks about, but he doesn't actually do it. So in our program, we actually do it. We just give everybody the federal employee health plan. Everybody on Medicare gets the federal employee health plan. Saves $1 trillion over 10 years and does actually, according to our projections, would eradicate the shortfall for Medicare. So I guess that I would stop there since I fixed Social Security and Medicare. I don't want to really brag or anything. So
thank you for the.
Now I just need a few votes. If I only had a few votes to support my ideas, but we didn't get any support from Democrats on this. In fact, one of the Democrats' main complaints, I tried to talk to some who I thought might discuss the issue. Their main complaint was that Obamacare got rid of, for congressmen, we're no longer part of the federal employee health plan, and there's a question whether or not it has to go into some kind of exchange like Obamacare. So they said we couldn't do it because we're getting rid of the one part of government that actually kind of works, which is a federal employee health plan. So, but anyway, I'll stop there and I'll be happy to answer questions.
This is a larger than usual turnout, and one reason obviously is that you're seen as a potential presidential contender for 2016. What's the current state of your thinking on that possibility?
I want to be part of the national debate, so whether I run or not, being considered is something that allows me to have, I think, a larger microphone. We will continue to travel to the early primary states. I'll be in Iowa. I'll be in New Hampshire this spring. I think I'll also be in South Carolina in the summertime. So we're considering it. We won't make a decision before 2014.
The last one from me, and then we'll go to Stephanie Stephanie K., I won't attempt the last name because I'll just be embarrassed. Sam Youngman, and I think Mark Shields is waving his hand at me. If not, Mark, you'll get a question. So,
Just one, though.
just one.
All right.
In your view, do the bombings in Boston have any policy implications either on gun control or immigration?
You know, I think it's largely a mistake to talk about issues in the wake of crisis and in the wake of tragedy. You know, the one thing that's disappointed me about, I think gun control is a legitimate issue for our country to debate and decide where and how we can fix the problems of violence. But I really hate to see it. I'm a parent, and I have 3 boys, and I hate to see it in using people, I think, as props and politicizing people's tragedy. I mean, when I see the father and the mothers and them testifying, and I know they're coming voluntarily, and they want to come and be part of this debate, but it still saddens me just to see them. And I think that in some cases the president has used them as props, and that disappoints me. And the way I'd look at it, I do look at it a little bit in the sense of the tragedy. How could we have prevented the tragedy? And that's really why I come down on the side of not being for any of the proposals, because none of the proposals really would address the tragedy.
Stephanie K. from the Financial Times.
Senator, what's your position on Guantanamo Bay, on the prison in Guantanamo?
You know, I have not voted for any of the limitations on sending. There have been several amendments on sending people to Guantanamo Bay or not sending them there, and I have not voted on any of the limitations on that. I don't know that I have a great answer, to tell you the truth. There is a part of me that really does believe that you, even captured internationally, you ought to be accused of a crime, you know, and that people held indefinitely. I objected strongly to sending Americans there. And it surprises me that there are members of the U.S. Senate that would send Americans to Guantanamo Bay without charge, without trial, indefinitely. It disappoints me that the president, who, when he was a senator, appeared to be a little more of a civil libertarian, has said, well, I'm going to sign indefinite detention, but he said the same thing on drones. I don't intend to use them. Well, to me, that's sort of not strong enough language. He should have vetoed and never signed the NDAA, because we should not have on the books the power for any president to indefinitely detain Americans, send them to Guantanamo Bay without a trial or an accusation. So for Americans, I have really strong feelings. For others, it is difficult knowing what to do. And I think there's sort of a spectrum. I think Americans, anybody accused of a crime in America gets due process without question, without exception, and I think it's an absolute. If you're overseas and you're captured in a battlefield and you're shooting at us, I think you get no due process, probably zero due process if you're firing a weapon at us or you're involved in a battle. Then there's sort of a murky in between of those who we think are committing maybe battle during the daytime and now are sleeping in their house at night. And so they're, you know, what do you do when you capture those people? Where do you take them? If you bring them to the U.S., do you then have to have due process? There are a lot of questions, and I don't think there are easy questions on this, but I haven't come down on the position of closing Guantanamo Bay.
Sam?
Senator, I'd like to go back to the Commonwealth if I could. After your primary, most of the calls I was getting oppo against you, telling me how terrible you were from Republicans in Kentucky who were loyal to Trey, loyal to Senator McConnell. There was a rift between you and the senator that you could run the derby through. I guess my question is, how much are you willing? How hard are you going to work for him to get reelected?
I've endorsed him. I've raised money for him. And, you know, I will work to try to see him reelected. I think he's good for Kentucky.
Let me just follow up. How do you view him? Is he a mentor? Is he somebody you're learning from? Or is he somebody you're not quite on the same page with?
You know, Thoreau is a mentor. You know, I think when we call people a mentor, I think that overstates. I mean, we're colleagues, and I do respect him, and he's been here a long time. He has a lot of knowledge of the Senate, and we work together on a lot of things. We were just down in Kentucky working on freedom to fish, keeping the federal government out of our fishing rights next to the dam. So, you know, we interact on a lot of things. And really, to tell you the truth, I think what I would say about Senator McConnell is that I don't think he ever personally disliked me. You know, people work against each other in campaigns, and particularly people who've been involved in politics for a long time, I think don't take it very personally. And so the one thing he did, which was a very, I think, significant thing for me and for the party, was he called us all up 3 months before the primary and said, I want you to sign a promise to come to a unity rally 3 days after the election. And it was a stroke of genius to do that, because then we didn't bicker. There wasn't sort of the establishment against the upstart. Everybody showed up. All the Republican congressmen, my opponent showed up, both my opponents showed up, and it was a good thing. But it was a smart thing on his point.
Did you think Trey was going to win at that point?
No, I think he actually didn't know at that point. The polls had really shifted. This was a month or two before, and we were actually doing pretty well in the polls at that point. No, and some might have thought maybe I wouldn't sign that pledge, but I did, and you know, I wanted there to be no question I was supporting the Republican nominee, and that's, you know, sort of been my approach with the presidential politics and everything. You know, I said I was going to support the nominee, you know, once my dad acknowledged that the nomination was over.
Mark?
Senator, I want to salute you for being the first person in memory to bracket McConnell and Thoreau in the same. It's a concept that some of us have to get our hands around right now. I wanted to ask you, in your own lifetime, what president of the other party do you most admire and why?
Probably Grover Cleveland. He stood. Oh, that's not your eye. Okay. Yeah. Well, he's quick.
We've got
quick.
lots of rules
He's
here,
quick.
you know.
So I have to answer his question. I can't answer the question I want to answer.
Well,
No, I was told that I could
that
answer
rule
the
probably
question.
still applies.
Oh, in my lifetime, a Democrat. You know, I guess Kennedy was a president while I was like 6 months old, I think, when he was shot in 63, but it's fall or summer or fall. November, yes. I'm 6 months old, so it would be from Kennedy on forward. Not an LBJ fan, definitely. I think he was sort of a creature and of something that you know, out of Washington, and there's a lot of things that I think are bad that come out of Washington. And you know, even though he's from Texas, you know, it's just a lot. I wasn't too happy with LBJ. You know, then you've got Jimmy Carter, who I think is the best ex-president we've ever had. I'll put him in that category, and a lot of people have said that. You know, and you got Clinton. You know, I think the only one that I could, you know, that some conservatives point to, and I might as well, would be, you know, that people point to Kennedy reducing taxes and actually growing the economy, as well as reducing unemployment, and as well as, you know, increasing, I think revenue actually increased even though he cut rates, you know. So I'd probably say Kennedy. And I think Kennedy also captured the American imagination somewhat. I think falsely sometimes, though, too, because I think the media gave him a pass. And, you know, nowadays I don't think that would happen probably to either side. But, you know, but I guess I'd say Kennedy among ones since I've been living.
Yes, ma'am.
Senator, you spoke at Howard University last week. How do you think your message was perceived there? And do you plan on doing any more outreach speeches like that? And if so, what would you do differently next time?
About 3 days later, I spoke to Simmons College, which is a historically black college in Louisville. I thought my reception at Howard was much better than my reception from the left-wing media. So if you're here from the left-wing media, I didn't appreciate your reception. But Howard, actually, I think was very fair. I'd never met Kurt Schmoke before, but I've always been a fan of Kurt Schmoke's. I told him that I could remember back in probably when he was mayor, Reason magazine writing about him and about him trying to decriminalize and lessen some of the penalties for nonviolent crime, which I've always been a supporter of. And so I enjoyed meeting Kurt Schmoke. And, you know, we have a bill on mandatory minimums that I'm working with Leahy. We actually may try to see if he'll come back and testify if he likes the bill. So, no, I think the reception was good. I think people, I'll give you an example of how sometimes reporting's not accurate. One young man stood up and said, I worked for a pro-Obama super PAC registering voters. Somebody in the media described him as someone who was just from a generic voter registration group. He said he worked for the president. So, I mean, that's a difficult vote for me to get. It's a difficult person even to get, entree into them considering Republicans. So it wasn't an easy audience, but I thought it was a beginning of a conversation. The other thing I would say is that, and things that annoy me is that people want to just, I was completely blasted by some of the left wing for being out of touch and knowing nothing about the Southern strategy, and that's why African Americans became Democrats, which is flat out wrong. Look at the facts. In a huge way, and the statistics aren't great in the 20s, but they say some say Hoover may have gotten 2/3 of the African-American vote, and some say most of the statistics in 32 say Roosevelt got 2/3 of the vote. It changed in a huge way in 1932. South side of Chicago was Republican, had a Republican congressman. He was elected 26, 28, 30, and 32. He loses in 34 in the south side of Chicago, becomes Democrat in 1934. So for people to tell me, the reason Republicans are hated by African-American community is because of the Southern strategy, it may have cemented the change, but the change did happen during the Great Depression. And I think it's wrong of us. And the change happened, and I said this in my speech, and most people ignored it, the change happened among whites and blacks. A lot of people switched their registration in the 1930s. Roosevelt won overwhelming victories, but the one thing he did is the African-American vote changed in 1932. It increased in 1936 when Truman endorses civil rights in 1948. The Dixiecrats break off, but the vote becomes overwhelmingly African-American vote for Truman. He also integrated the armed services. So you get to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and you got 90% of the people, African-Americans, voting for LBJ. The Southern strategy, by most reports, is after that, not before that. So it's solidified, but it didn't cause the change. And people who write that are just factually wrong. But they do it simply, I think, for partisan purposes, because how a Republican's not allowed to go and be part of that debate and talk about it. And it really did have to do with the Great Depression. It had to do, I think, with, and everybody can have an opinion. It had to do with a lot of things, but I think it had to do with the lack of economic emancipation among African Americans. They wanted more, and they didn't feel like they were getting it from Republicans.
And in terms of doing it again and doing more, just to follow up,
Yes.
Merkel?
I plan on doing it, yes, again and more. And I've done one already since then at Simmons College. And, we'll continue to do that. And I think, but it's anybody who thinks it's going to be easy and that all of a sudden we're going to switch. Although I would say the one thing that's encouraging from history is the amazing switch from 28 to 32. If you could get a Republican that could switch the vote like 28 to 32, all of a sudden things would be topsy-turvy. But I would say if you change Ohio from 5% African Americans voting Republican to 10%, all of a sudden Ohio comes into play.
We're going to go next to Carl Lubsdorff, Michael Warren, John Ward, Jim Avila, Robert Schlesinger, David Grant, Jerry Zermski. Mr. Lubsdorff.
Senator, I'd like to go back to gun control. When someone raised the subject, your first answer was to talk about children being used as props, which is frankly sort of a red herring, because that's really not what the issue is. Do you think there's a problem that needs to be dealt with, or do you think there's no problem?
If it's a red herring, then you're saying the president bringing all those families here is a red herring?
Why don't you answer the question directly about what you think should be done in the area, if something should be done,
no, but
rather
if
than
you're
the
saying it's a red herring
theatrics?
for me to bring up my kids, is it a red herring for the president to bring up the children who were shot?
But that's not the issue in gun control.
Well, I think it is, because the thing is that I'm someone who's presenting a face to the public, and the face I want to present is that I do care about those kids, and that I understand the grief that they're going through, and that I do care about it. So I think, politics isn't about only about the facts. It is about whether you're seen as being empathetic, and I do want people to know that I do care about those families and I understand their grief.
But do you think there's anything the federal government ought to do that would create more safety by restricting access or by registering guns so that criminals and terrorists and various people can't have access to them so easily?
The current background checks that we have found 15,000 people to be felons and that were kicked out of the system. We prosecuted 44 of them. So I am supporting Senator Cruz's legislation to shift money around and increase the prosecution of those who are felons. I think it's simplistic to say, we stopped 15,000 felons from getting guns. Well, maybe they went to another dealer that wasn't as precise, or maybe they bought them illegally. If you didn't prosecute them, you didn't stop them from getting guns. You stopped them at that place from getting a gun. So I think if what we ought to do is make sure that the background checks that we have are working, and I do favor that. And the bill may do a few other things. But I do think that ultimately, this is the way I look at it, and this is just my opinion, but I think it's shared by a lot of Americans. The shootings at Sandy Hook, that young man who committed these atrocious murders, he was not deterred by the death penalty. He was not deterred by life imprisonment. He was not deterred by being killed, because in the event, at the end, he killed himself. Most of these killers are exactly the same. They usually die in the end. They don't seem to be afraid to die. So I don't think if they're not afraid of the death penalty that somehow they're going to fear gun registration, and that gun registration would deter them. They seem to be choosing places that are gun-free zones. And so another thing that I would do, and more of this probably involves local law than federal law, but if I were in charge of that school district, I would be lobbying to allow teachers to have concealed carry, to have a gun locked up in a desk drawer, for the principal to have it. Ultimately, that's the only thing I know of that might have saved any lives in this situation, because we have gun registration up there. The cities that we have the most significant gun control seem to have the most significant crime in our country.
Michael, I'm sorry.
What's wrong with their concept of universal registration?
I think, one, it doesn't go to the problem. If the problem is mass shootings by young men at gun-free zones, registration doesn't deter these young men. Registration works for law-abiding citizens. If you look at crime, nearly 90% of crime is committed by guns that are bought illegally already. If you look at gun shows, I think in 2004 they did a survey of inmates, and it was like 1.7% were committed with guns from gun shows. So, I think that if the background checks work, why don't we enforce what we've got? And I think that would be a good first step forward. I think a lot of things in Washington are done as window dressing. It's a dog and pony show, it's a parade, it's theatrics and histrionics, all to show people that something bad happened, which it did. Something terrible and tragic happened. I don't want to demean or in any way lessen that, but the response to it is, hey, look at me, I did something, even though in the end, and there have been, I think, Richard Cohen in the Washington Post is probably not considered to be a right-wing zealot on the Second Amendment, but he wrote yesterday that the background checks won't do anything, even making them universal.
Michael Warren?
There used to be a debate, you don't hear much about it anymore, in the conservative movement about Abraham Lincoln's legacy with a lot of these issues that you were talking about, rule of law, due process, that sort of thing. And you spoke a lot about Abraham Lincoln last week at Howard. I'm just curious what your opinion of Abraham Lincoln, his legacy is.
There's a great book on Lincoln called Forced into Glory by Lerone Bennett, and it's a good book. And there's a great passage in there that I think it's by a Reconstruction Republican. I have a quote as one of the leads in the chapter, and he says that Lincoln shouldn't be allowed to ride into glory on the borrowed plumage, from somebody else's hat, from their glorious ride. And I think there's some truth to that. I think Lincoln turned out to be a great politician, but I think he wasn't a god, he was a politician, and he came into his glory because of some people who I think were even greater than he was. And the people I would consider to be greater than Lincoln would be the abolitionists who pushed him kicking and screaming towards emancipation. No, in the end, Lincoln was, I think, absolutely a great president. It was something, emancipation is something to be very proud of for him and for the Republican Party. But really, I think our history books, when I grew up reading, all the description of abolitionists were zealots, nuts, crazy, and it's a lot more complicated than that. And a lot of them, William Lloyd Garrison fought this battle for 30 some odd years, was beaten up, mobbed, nearly killed, So I think that I think the abolitionists deserve more credit than they're given.
John Ward?
Senator, I just wanted to go back to Howard, and I'm sensitive to your concern that the whole event was portrayed negatively. I don't mean to suggest that. I think the reception was, at many points, pretty good. But there was that moment where you seem to be assuming that the students didn't know some things about history. Is that accurate, that you made some assumptions that turned out to be wrong? And what else did you
No, and I
learn?
think that was misreported. I simply said something, and it was something that I was asking a question. I asked, "Do you know?" And I didn't know the answer. This was my first time to go to a historically black college, so I asked, and people say, "Well, you should know the answer." Well, that was part of the reason for going there, is I didn't know the answer. I said, did they all know that the NAACP was founded by Republicans? And in retrospect, it sounds like it is a dumb question, but it's like Republicans haven't been going to Howard for 20 years, so maybe by me going there, I did learn something. And I did learn that everybody there knows, and I left knowing that everybody there knows. But here's a good question for you, and this is where I think it's unfair what the media tries to do to me on this. Take a poll. Well, here's a good example of a poll. When the Iraq War started, right after 9/11, they polled Americans and they said, how many of you, or who do you think, attacked us on 9/11? Over 50% of the public thought Iraq attacked us on 9/11. It's still true. Probably 50% of the public still doesn't know. If you ask the American public, this includes a lot of white people who haven't had black history, but even some people in the African American community, you ask them, did the Republicans, were they a primary part of voting rights and citizenship and NAACP getting formed and ending Jim Crow? And did you know that most African Americans were Republicans at one time? People who've taken black history do know that, and I was told that in no uncertain terms. But I think the vast majority of the public, I think you'd find that 90% of the public has no idea that Republicans helped to found the NAACP. And so some people think, well, it's presumptuous and I shouldn't be talking about it. Well, we need to talk about it. And then I messed up on the senator's name, Edward Brooke, and it's like, I'm human. I forgot his name. I knew his name, but I forgot it. It wasn't like it was part of my speech and I forgot it. It was in question and answer. How many other people do 30 minutes of question and answer, and I forgot his name? But the point I was making that was from Edward Brooke was he was asked in his 90s about the rich history of the Republican Party and African Americans, and he was asked, his response was, he said, well, if the Democrats had this history, you'd hear about it nonstop. And he said it was the indication was a problem that Republicans didn't talk about their rich history. It is harder for me. I'm not African American to go to Howard and talk about it. It'd be easier for an African American Republican maybe to go, because then it's seen less as me trying to preach to people about their history. But it's all of our history. There were whites involved too with abolition and getting rid and with emancipation. So I don't know. I'm a little sensitive to some of it in the sense that I think the people who write on one side of it write simply because they don't like Republicans, and so anything a Republican says, the left-wing media, I think, is done that way without really, I think, looking at the facts. Same with the Southern strategy. I think they're completely wrong on the Southern strategy. The Southern strategy cemented a change, but the change occurred before the Southern strategy. That's just a fact.
Sorry, Jim?
Senator, I'm going to stand up since I can't really see you over there, but I have two questions. I think they're related. The first one is on the immigration bill. I wonder if we could ask you your reaction, your response to what has actually now been written, and are you now willing to endorse a pathway to citizenship? And I use that particular word for those who are undocumented. The second question I think is related is, will this bill, will immigration reform help America's drug problem? And would it help in the Rand Paul America that would decriminalize some of these drugs if there is an immigration reform bill?
The bill's pretty long, and last night when I left to go home, it still wasn't available. And I'm assuming, does anybody know, is it now online?
Yes.
It's now online. Yeah. So we're going to read it is the first thing we'll do, and that'll take a while to read all of it. There are a lot of details in it. What I will tell you in general is I am for immigration reform. I am for finding a place for those who are in our country, whether documented or undocumented, finding a place for them if they want to work. It's not that I'm going to be for anything with no rules, though. Conservatives have always said they wanted secure borders. They always complained about the 1986 bill and said they promised us security and we never got the secure borders. So I will have at least one amendment, but I probably will have 3 or 4 amendments that I want to be attached to the bill I think will make it stronger. I think it's important for everybody who wants immigration reform to realize it has to go through the House. House is very conservative and controlled by Republicans who haven't been too excited about immigration reform. So in order to get it, I think they need to at least engage with people like me who want immigration reform but are from the conservative wing of the party. The amendment I have is trust but verify, and it says that each year, in order for the reform to go forward, there has to be a report on border security. This should include the opinions of the governors. This should include the opinions of the Border Patrol on whether or not each section of the either fence or border has been secured. It should include statistics on how many are being returned who come here illegally, how many people are getting background checks, that kind of thing. And that report, I think, should be voted on by Congress. I'm not a big fan of administrative reports. We're supposed to get a report on whether Egypt is democratic in order for them to get their foreign aid, and they just either give it or exempt it every year. I don't think there's enough really seriousness on the part of any administration on these reports. So I'd have it voted on by Congress, because you can get rid of your congressman or woman if you don't like them. But I am in general for immigration reform. As far as a pathway to citizenship, I think the other thing is I think it's important for conservatives to support the bill that it's no new pathway to citizenship. My opinion all along has been that if you're here and you're undocumented and we give you a work visa, that we allow you then to get in the same line that someone gets in if they're in Mexico City. So if you're in Mexico City right now and you want to become an American citizen, there is a line. If you're an undocumented alien here in this country and we give you a work visa, I'd say you get in the same line. My understanding, the bill is going to create a new line, but give a certain amount of years to try to make it where you don't get in front of somebody in the other line. Some of this is a rhetorical point, but it's also important to a lot of people who don't want a new pathway. So I think if it were the same pathway as someone in Mexico City, we have a better chance of passing immigration reform. And so that's something we'll look at. We also think that when you go to vote through Motor Voter, you're supposed to show up with your driver's license. I think that when you show up with your driver's license, no matter who you are, you should be run through the work visa database to make sure you're not here on a work visa, because there's going to be millions of people here on work visas now, and they shouldn't be immediately eligible to vote just because they have a driver's license. Same with welfare. I think all of these have an exclusion for welfare, but if you're not allowed to ask or check whether you're here legally or not, there could well be people signing up for welfare. So with all the rules, yes, I'm in favor of it. We'll see how many of any of these things I can get attached to it, but I think some of these things will be popular in the House, and if we want to move forward, I think that hopefully they'll address some of these things.
Mr. Schlesinger.
Criticism of the Howard speech was that you, in your characterization of the history of the two parties and their roles in the civil rights movement, you sort of glossed over the past 50 years, post 1965. How would you characterize the two parties' roles in civil rights in that time period?
Well, if you go up to 1964 and you look at it, like, for example, I think there were two civil rights bills in the 50s that didn't pass, and I think Kennedy votes against both of them, and a majority of Republican senators vote for both of them. Same happens in 64. Still, a vast majority of Republicans vote for the Civil Rights Act in 64. The Southern strategy I didn't mention, but I didn't really kind of go there to sort of mention the things that don't make us look so good in the Republican Party. So that was one reason for not bringing up the Southern strategy. And the comments by Kevin Phillips were unsavory and not something that will help us ever, and probably did hurt us in solidifying the African American vote, frankly. But I guess my point is just they didn't cause it. And you can follow up with that. Was there something else you were asking?
Well, how do you characterize the history post-65?
Well, I think some of it's fair and some of it's unfair. I mean, people have told me they think that, the Willie Brown ad was racist. People say that Reagan talking about welfare queens was racist. There may be some argument to some of those things. What's that? Yeah, what did I say? Yeah, see, I do make mistakes. But anyway, so that's what I meant. But I think that I think there is some basis in arguments that of some of the tactics through the years, and so I think And the other thing is, whether it's fair or not fair, there is a perception out there, the Republican Party, and I think this is what it is in general. There's a perception that Republicans don't like people of color. They don't like black people, brown people, or people of different color skin. It's not true, but that's the perception that we have to overcome. And the only way we overcome that, I think, is by showing up and saying over and over again that it is not true. And I wanted part of that to be talking about our rich history in civil rights. I think that's an uphill battle too, because I got a lot of grief for the audacity of mentioning it. But I think I think it's a rich history. I'll keep trying. I'm sort of, I don't give up easily, so I'll keep trying.
We've got about 15 minutes left. We're going to go to the back tables now. David Grant and then Jerry Zaremski. David?
Senator, you said you're skeptical of sort of administration reports and them sort of grading their own homework, so to speak. But of course, the bill that the Senate Gang of Eight has put forward, that's how that's how people get legalized, is the Department of Homeland Security has to submit 2 reports within 6 months. So it sounds that you're somewhat skeptical of that. And I would just ask you if you're interested, on a separate point, of reaching out to Hispanic communities, of doing some of the things that you're doing in the African American community with Hispanics as well.
Yes, I've been to speak to the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce not too long ago, and that was a beginning of what I will consider to be trying to go and talk to. When I first ran, people said, that's Mrs. Smith over there, you need to ask Mrs. Smith for a vote, and I thought it was kind of corny. I'm a physician. I thought you just told people what you represented and they went home and made their decision. But they're like, oh no, you got to ask Mrs. Smith for her vote. And I think symbolically that's true with Republicans and different ethnic groups where we do not seem to be doing well, is we need to show up and ask for their vote. And that sounds corny, and I showed up at Howard. Did I get anybody to change their mind? I don't know. But I showed up at Simmons 2 days later, and one gentleman came up and said he wants to start Facebook for Rand Paul, African Americans for Rand Paul. So maybe that was only one person out of 50, but it's still a step forward. And but I think that we try on the reports. I think overall border security is more important. You talked about whether the executive branch makes some determinations on who gets the visas. There will be administrative stuff that has to be part of the executive branch. So I'm not completely opposed to that. I'm just saying border security has been what conservatives have complained about. It's what they're fearful of. I think it limits. There's some conservatives who will never vote for any immigration reform. But there's another big block of conservatives that I think I'm part of that will vote for immigration reform if they're assured and reassured that the border will be secure. So there's some votes you're not going to get, but there's a huge amount. I don't think this is a great thing for the House if it takes 180 Democrats and 40 Republicans to pass, over in the House, or if it passes with 50 Democrats on our side and 5 Republicans, So, I'm looking for a way to make more of the Republican Party come over and embrace immigration reform.
Do you think that, just to be specific, do you think that that's a problem that they've set up at the beginning? I mean, the very first portion of the Senate bill is the administration basically says, this is our plan. Then people get legalized, whether it's within 6 months after the bill is enacted. I mean, do you think that that's an impediment, as you pointed out, to conservatives getting on board with this, particularly perhaps in the House?
Maybe. I mean, all the conservatives in the House, and still the House plan is to do a bunch of different bills. And I was always a fan of that, actually, really, too. And everybody said, oh, you'll never get comprehensive reform if you do them one at a time and you take the most popular ones. I disagree. I think everything in Washington is broken because every bill is too big and every deal attempts to be too big. So, for example, like on tax reform, tomorrow I would lower the income tax. We can compromise on the number. I'd lower it to 17% tomorrow. Just do it. I don't care if people predicted less revenue. Less revenue up here means more revenue in the economy. It'd be an enormous boost to the economy. And really, like under Kennedy, like under Coolidge, and like under Reagan, when you reduce rates, sometimes you get more revenue. So, but it's because the deal's too big. Same way with immigration. We make it harder on ourselves, or the debt commission, or any of these things. We make it a lot harder to find a deal when it has 1,000 moving parts. I think we should go with the things we agree on and just boom, 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 just start. It's why the public's upset with us. They're like, why don't we ever pass anything? Why can't we get along? Well, all the stuff we agree on, we won't pass because we say, oh, that's going to be the sweetener for the bigger deal, which we never seem to be able to get. So why not break up all these big deals into smaller deals? I tried to pass the STEM visas, the science and technology visas, expanding those, the Raul Labrador bill. I tried to pass it by unanimous consent. And then Schumer came up and said, no, but I'll pass, how about passing mine by unanimous consent? And I was actually quiet. I would have let his go by unanimous consent too. They'd have been shocked by that. But then we'd have gotten something done. I think it would have been great fun to see that all of a sudden we passed part of immigration reform just by unanimous consent.
Jerry?
Yes, the guy from Buffalo, I have to ask you why you think so highly of our late mayor, Grover Cleveland.
Well, if I was allowed to go back to when I wasn't alive, you know, he seemed to be opposed to special interests. He also seemed to veto a bunch of bills. And I think that, you know, it was a time period, and I think some would call him a populist, and I think that a part of me feels that way.
We're going to probably just get in two more, Alex Bolton and then Doyle. Alex?
Hi. It was reported that you were raising money for the National Association for Gun Rights, and it was also reported that last week this came up for conversation in the steering committee luncheon. Susan Collins was pretty upset about that because National Association for Gun Rights is running ads in her state. She's warning it could cost the party her seat. Are you going to not do that in the future? Are you going to change your course of action given what Collins said to you, given that perhaps you could be jeopardizing a seat in Maine?
When you say raising money for, I have signed fundraising letters for them. I don't have a connection with the group. It's illegal for me to have a direct connection with the group or to talk about what ads they run or not. Also illegal for me to actually call them up and say, quit running ads against certain people. Now, I can make a decision in the future over whether I'll continue to do it, and I haven't come to a conclusion or thought that through yet. But I can say I don't always agree with every tactic of every group out there. You know, that includes a lot of groups. You know, there are three big gun groups, National Association of Gun Rights, Gun Owners of America, and the NRA. And I don't agree with all of them all the time, but I am on the side of wanting to protect the Second Amendment and believe it's just as important as the other parts of the Bill of Rights. So I don't know with regard to that. I have never worked against any Republican in our primary, and I don't anticipate working against a Republican in our primary.
Well, what sort of role do you see yourself having in the 2014 Republican primaries? Even if not, do you see yourselves getting involved in a race, with?
We got involved in some primaries that were open primaries where there wasn't an incumbent, but at this time I don't have any plans to oppose any incumbent Republican.
Doyle?
Senator, let me ask you to return to the subject of your filibuster, and that was drones, and particularly turn to drones overseas. What's next on your agenda on that issue? Have you found any Democratic civil libertarians who are working with you? And then on one particular issue, as you know, a lot of the drone war overseas is being waged under an authorization for use of military force that was passed in haste, 11, 12 years ago. Are you working to re-examine that, and have you got anything going there?
Ron Wyden is the one I work most closely with on civil liberty issues and the drone issue, and he was nice enough to come to the floor in support of the filibuster. And so he and I continue to work on a range of issues. We worked on the SOPA legislation together. We are co-sponsors of a federal waiver for hemp growing in the states, things like that. On issues of war, I don't want to characterize his position, but his and Merkley's, we've worked together. I think Wyden's been on those letters we've sent to the president to speed up the resolution of the Afghan war. And then the second, the authorization of force. I think we have a chance to talk about this. It'll be tricky to see where we can go with this. Senator Corker has talked about bringing this up in the Foreign Relations Committee. It is a real significant problem that, and it's part of this thing that I was talking about with the drones. There are people in my party who think the battlefield is everywhere and the war has no limits, and that this use of authorization of force to go to war in Afghanistan is for war everywhere all the time without limits. I have a real problem with that, particularly when they say the battlefield is here, because I do acknowledge that if you're engaged in a battlefield, for example, if you're in Afghanistan and we're fighting soldiers over there, we're not going to give them Miranda rights. There is no due process in a battle. It becomes a little more of a question if they're eating dinner in their house, and then it's an even bigger question if you're eating dinner in America in a cafe or in your house. So that was a huge question, but it works all the way back. There's a spectrum of still needing it. And also, can you go to war in Mali or Libya under the use of authorization of force that was done for Afghanistan? But I'll tell you how hard this battle will be. I tried to remove the use of force, authorization of force for Iraq last year. And the war's over there. I couldn't get them to stop a war that's already done. And but the reason why I think it's important to take the use of authorization force back, that's the people's power and Congress's power. It's ultimately the people's power through Congress, but that was power was separated. And as long as we have it dangling out there, we've given carte blanche to any president to commit war anytime, anywhere. And then there's the debate of whether or not they can infringe upon civil liberties here at home through that force. So no, I don't think we'll completely get rid of it. I think what they'll do is try to rewrite it. I'm for ending the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, and I would rescind both. And then I would have debates over where you want to go again. Really, that's what they intended, is that we would debate and discuss whether national security is involved, whether vital interests are involved. And Mali is different than Afghanistan. I think the country was almost universally united. Let's go to Afghanistan and get those people attacked us, myself included. I don't know that the public's entirely united on going into Syria, Mali, or Libya. And, I think there's, I keep saying, why don't we ask the million Christians in Syria what they want, They were displaced, 250,000 of them were displaced from Iraq because they didn't like the government they got in Iraq after the war. And are they going to like al-Nusra as their new government in Syria? I've ventured to say some of the Christians may object.
I promised to have the senator up and moving by 9:25, and I don't think we have time for another question and answer, so we want to thank you. My apologies to my colleagues who didn't get a question. We'll have to have him back. Thanks so much, sir.
Thank you very
Appreciate
much.
it. And it's all well with your dad.
Sam, while we're staying here, I actually spending part of